Good morning, everyone. Last time, we plunged into Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, specifically Chapter 1, Prejudices of Philosophers. Remember, we saw Nietzsche on a mission to unmask the unacknowledged biases, those hidden motivations that so often lurk beneath grand philosophical systems. We even touched on his audacious challenge to the very idea of a pure, disinterested will to truth. He hinted, didn't he, that it often conceals other, perhaps less, noble drives. And we pondered, how could a philosopher's personal quirks, their unexamined baggage, subtly mold their supposedly universal truths? Well, today we're going deeper, much deeper. We're not just looking at Nietzsche's claims, but at his methods, the implications of his entire critical project. Think, hermeneutics, methodological self-awareness, and yes, even the meta-philosophical earthquakes his work triggers in how we even define philosophy. It's quite the journey. So, today, we pivot to Aphorism 7. And this is where Nietzsche's critique of these so-called prejudices gets incredibly concrete, personal even. He shifts gears, moving from those broader philosophical tendencies we discussed to a very specific historical snapshot. Why? To illuminate the interpersonal wrestling matches, the psychological currents that can profoundly shape philosophical debate. We'll see him wielding psychological interpretation, digging into etymology, all to expose what he sees as the rather grubby origins of a famous philosophical insult. And that crucial question from last time, if philosophers are driven by these less than lofty motives, how on earth do we assess their critiques? Well, that question becomes razor sharp right here, especially as we dare to ask, does Nietzsche himself escape the very charges he's so busy leveling? Think about that. Nietzsche kicks off Aphorism 7 with a bang, a truly provocative exclamation. Listen to this.
How malicious philosophers can be. I do not know anything more venomous than the joke Epicurus allowed himself against Plato and the Platonists. He called them Dionysiokolakes.
Pow! Right out of the gate, Nietzsche isn't framing this as some dry academic disagreement, is he? No, he calls it malice. Venomous joke. Now, the German term he uses, Bosheit, it's fascinating. Malice gets us close, but Bosheit, it suggests something more. A deliberate, almost artful cultivation of ill will. A kind of gleeful spite. This isn't just any old prejudice. It's personal. It's vivid. It's precisely the kind of hidden psychological driver he's been hinting at in philosophers throughout Aphorisms 1 through 6. And Epicurus's insult of Plato. That's his star exhibit. Of course, we have to ask, is Nietzsche perhaps dialing up the malice a bit for dramatic effect? It's possible, and we can circle back to that. But notice this, Nietzsche's own style in this aphorism, short, sharp, an interpretive stab. It mirrors the very joke he's dissecting. It's designed to wound, to unmask. So, the question hangs in the air, doesn't it? Is this aphorism itself a performance of the psychological insight, maybe even the Bosheit he pins on Epicurus? And let's be real, this kind of public intellectual sparring isn't some relic of ancient Greece. Think about the often barbed exchanges on social media today between so-called public intellectuals. Sharp critique or personal attack. The line gets blurry fast. Now, before we dive into Nietzsche's take on that insult, just pause for a second. Reflect. Can you think of times, maybe even in today's world, where what looks like an intellectual critique might actually be hiding some personal venom? That targeted Bosheit. So, Nietzsche then rolls up his sleeves to unpack this term. Dionysiokolakes. And this, my friends, is where his interpretive genius truly ignites. He tells us,
Literally, the foreground meaning of this term is sycophants of Dionysus, and therefore accessories of the tyrant and brown noses. But it also wants to say they're all actors. There's nothing genuine about them, since Dionysiokolakes was a popular term for an actor, and this second meaning is really the malice that Epicurus hurled against Plato.
You see, Nietzsche's diving deep into etymology here, a specific kind of hermeneutics, the art and science of interpretation. He's not satisfied with just scratching the surface. Oh no. That Greek term, Dionysiokolakes, it's far richer, far more cutting than just sycophants of Dionysus, or actors might first suggest. Think about the root, kolax. This isn't merely a flatterer. It's a fawning, parasitic type, someone who tramples civic virtue for their own gain. And linking this to Dionysus, especially potent. Remember Plato's famous beef with poets and Minuses, how he accused them of appealing to the soul's lower parts, of being 3 times removed from truth. Well, to be called a Dionysus flatterer, that's a charge of profound philosophical betrayal. It implies an embrace of illusion, ecstasy, the irrational, everything Dionysus stands for, over reason and the forms. This is worlds away from a simple brown-noser or a generic actor. This cuts deep. Nietzsche is absolutely playing detective with words here, isn't he? Hunting for that hidden jab. And when you wrestle with a text where one single word carries so much explosive power, it really throws a spotlight on the active, creative nature of interpretation. This is hermeneutics alive and kicking. Nietzsche is making a bold claim here about Epicurus's intent, all based on these layers of meaning. And this is precisely where you see different scholarly paths diverge, isn't it? A classical philologist, for instance, might meticulously sift through historical evidence for how Epicurus used Dionysiokolakes, its precise meaning at the time. They might say, "Hold on, Nietzsche. Your psychological leap isn't quite backed by the immediate linguistic facts." Then again, a deconstructionist might zero in on the very slipperiness of a word like genuine, that ich to Nietzsche implies. They'd question not just Epicurus's authority, but Nietzsche's too, in definitively pinning down this malice. So, let's try a quick thought experiment. What if Epicurus only meant actors in a totally neutral way, maybe just referring to the dialogue form Plato used? How would that totally shift Nietzsche's argument about his malice? What interpretive moves is Nietzsche making here, and what are their ripple effects? So, Nietzsche lays out the literal meaning, sycophants of Dionysus. That's already a pretty hefty insult, right? It suggests a cringing deference to some powerful, maybe tyrannical figure. But then, and this is crucial, Nietzsche steers our gaze to that secondary, popular meaning, actors. And he insists that this connotation, they're all actors, there's nothing genuine about them. That's where the true venom, the real Bosheit is, lodged. The core accusation then, inauthenticity, pure performance, no substance. This whole genuineness versus performance theme, it's a constant hum in Nietzsche's work. And here he's saying Epicurus had the same critical X-ray vision. The sheer weight Nietzsche puts on this specific interpretation is absolutely pivotal. Why? Because it's the springboard for his next big leap. A psychological deep dive into Epicurus's motivations. And this kind of interpretive gambit, focusing on authorial intent, on uncovering the real meaning bubbling beneath a loaded term, doesn't it echo those timeless debates in literary criticism? Think about it. Those endless questions about authorial intent versus the text's own life. Is the true sting of Epicurus's insult to be found in his supposed psychological state, as Nietzsche's about to argue? Or does it lie in the countless ways Dionysiokolakes, with all its theatrical sycophantic baggage, might have landed on its ancient audience, no matter what Epicurus was actually feeling? This just adds another fascinating layer to how we read Nietzsche reading Epicurus, doesn't it? All right, so Nietzsche has established what he believes is the core insult, an attack on Plato's genuineness. Now, watch this. He speculates, quite daringly, on Epicurus's underlying motivations. What was really eating at him? Nietzsche muses.
He was annoyed by the magnificent style, the mise-en-scène that Plato and his students were so good at, that Epicurus was not so good at. He, the old schoolmaster from Samos, who sat hidden in his little garden in Athens and wrote 300 books. Who knows? Perhaps out of anger and ambition against Plato.
What a picture Nietzsche paints. Epicurus, the old schoolmaster from Samos, completely overshadowed, stylistically speaking, by Plato's magnificent style and dazzling mise-en-scène. And isn't it interesting, Nietzsche's choice of that French term, mise-en-scène? It's not just setting. It deliberately injects this sense of theatrical staging, of artificiality, perhaps even a whiff of decadent French aesthetics, into his critique of Plato's whole presentation. Brilliant. This perceived shortcoming, Nietzsche implies, festered into annoyance, and then, perhaps out of anger and ambition against Plato, Epicurus unleashes his venomous joke. And, almost as an afterthought, maybe that's why he wrote a staggering 300 books. That rhetorical, who knows? It's so clever, isn't it? It performs the very speculative psychological guesswork Nietzsche is engaged in. A bold assertion dressed up as a casual question. Now, it's easy to just see this as, oh, that's just individual psychology. But wait a minute. We need to remember the bigger picture. This kind of intellectual slugfest wasn't just Epicurus and Plato having a bad day. It powerfully echoes the deeply embedded agonistic spirit of ancient Greek intellectual life. Philosophical schools back then? They fiercely competed. They defined themselves by tearing down their rivals. So, personal ambition? Sure, but it's playing out in a culturally approved arena, a contest of minds. And what's more, Nietzsche's method here, the psychological excavation, it's very much a product of his era. The 19th century was buzzing with new psychological interpretations of history, of culture. Now, Nietzsche is undeniably a trailblazer in using psychology as a sharp philosophical weapon. But his approach? It comes before the more formalized psychological theories of Freud and Jung in the 20th century. That's crucial context when we're trying to weigh the evidence for his claims about Epicurus's innermost thoughts and feelings. Here, Nietzsche is fully engaged in psychological interpretation. You can see it plain as day, and this, right here, is a nascent form of his renowned genealogical approach. He's digging for the unofficial origins, isn't he? Tracing Epicurus's critical jab not to some high-minded philosophical disagreement, but to deeply personal feelings. Envy of Plato's style, anger, ambition. This move radically shifts the entire game. It pulls the focus away from the logical soundness of philosophical claims and slams it down onto the psychological and emotional soil from which those claims spring. What a challenge to the traditional view of philosophy as a purely rational, detached pursuit. He's suggesting these attitudes, these positions, derive from decidedly non-rational sources. And his emphasis on style? That's not trivial. It elevates rhetoric and aesthetics from mere window dressing to essential components of philosophical meaning and impact. So, if all philosophy is a kind of personal confession, as Nietzsche suggested earlier, what's Epicurus confessing here through Nietzsche's lens? It looks a lot like a confession of insecurity, of resentment. Now, let's be clear. This psychological accusation is, without a doubt, the most incendiary part of the aphorism. Nietzsche's argument basically unfolds like this. Epicurus lands a venomous punch. The real poison is the charge. Actors, Nothing genuine there. Plato had a flair, a style, that Epicurus just couldn't match. Therefore, Epicurus's actions were likely fueled by good old-fashioned envy and ambition. Its strength? It's a compelling story, a cynically persuasive narrative. Its weakness? Well, the evidence for Epicurus's inner turmoil is inferred, to say the least. And this, right here, is where we, as interpreters ourselves, hit that perennial wall. How do we balance a potentially brilliant psychological insight against the danger of anachronism, or, worse, just projecting our own stories onto the past? It's a razor's edge to walk, folks. And frankly, it highlights the profound, almost dizzying difficulty of trying to truly access the inner worlds of historical figures with any degree of certainty. We just have to own the complexity of interpretation here. Profound complexity. Nietzsche, of course, is using a psychological ad hominem attack to expose what he claims are the ad hominem motivations of other philosophers. So, the million-dollar question becomes, does Nietzsche's own unmasking manage to stay free of the very drives he's attributing to everyone else? His own quite visible venom in critique can sometimes look suspiciously like what he's describing. Indeed, if his method implies that all philosophical pronouncements are potentially rooted in such drives, then his own pronouncements here are absolutely fair game. What anger and ambition might be simmering beneath Nietzsche's particular staging of this Epicurus versus Plato drama? And just like that, his method circles back, fascinatingly, devouring its own tail. One could almost say, with a wry smile, that philosophy sometimes feels like a bewildering hall of mirrors, each thinker reflecting, and perhaps artfully deflecting, their own methods and motives. Nietzsche's relentless focus on Epicurus's alleged personal failings, rather than, say, the meaty philosophical differences between Epicurean materialism and Platonic idealism, can definitely feel like an ad hominem argument. Of course, Nietzsche's whole point is that such ad hominem motivations do drive philosophers. But this approach risks reductionism, doesn't it? Simplifying what was undoubtedly a complex intellectual dance. To engage with this responsibly, we should treat Nietzsche's reading as one powerful perspective, certainly, but one shaped by his own grand project of unmasking. We could, for instance, set it against other scholarly takes on Epicurus. Or we could dissect the argument's logical structure, really interrogating that leap from stylistic difference to deep-seated personal animosity. Consider this. How might a Straussian reading approach Nietzsche's critique here? They might hunt for an esoteric hidden teaching, perhaps seeing the Epicurus-Plato clash as a coded commentary on the philosopher's tricky relationship with the polis, the city-state. Fascinating now. For example, one alternative take might see Epicurus's label actors not as a personal jab, but as a substantive critique of Platonism's perceived detachment from the nitty-gritty of material reality, a critique of its performance of transcendence, rather than a genuine engagement with lived, breathed experience. That would make the insult less about personal malice and much more about fundamental, bedrock philosophical disagreement. See the difference? Another reading, maybe a psychoanalytic one, might dig even deeper into that. Anger and ambition. Could it be linked to Oedipal rivalries with a philosophical father figure like Plato? Or, even more intriguingly, could we see in Nietzsche's depiction of Epicurus, the old schoolmaster from Samos, who sat hidden in his little garden in Athens and wrote 300 books, a subtle, perhaps unconscious, self-portrait of Nietzsche himself, working in relative isolation, railing against the dominant Platonism of his own time? If that's the case, then his interpretation of Epicurus becomes intensely personal, powerfully, performatively self-reflective. Wow, Wow. Nietzsche then wraps up the aphorism with a haunting reflection on how history remembers Epicurus.
It took 100 years for Greece to find out who this garden god Epicurus had been. Did it find out?
This final, lingering question, it just hangs there, doesn't it? After such a pointed, almost surgical psychological diagnosis, this question feels especially sharp, resonant. Its unresolved nature really underscores the sheer difficulty of achieving any definitive interpretation. Does it mean Epicurus is still misunderstood, precisely because the kind of malice Nietzsche attributes to him, and, perhaps, to his interpreters too, clouds everyone's judgment? Or is it hinting at something bigger? That true, complete understanding of any historical figure is just an elusive dream? Perhaps even a moment of methodological humility from Nietzsche, a stark contrast to his earlier, more assertive claims. And this question, did it find out? We can turn it right back on Nietzsche himself. Will we ever truly find out who Nietzsche was? Or is all interpretation just an endless, unfolding process, forever shaped by our own ever-shifting perspectives? Indeed, this very question of historical recovery and legacy has profoundly shaped how Nietzsche's own work has been understood over time. Think about it. Early biographical and psychological readings. They eventually gave way to existentialist interpretations. Then came post-structuralist analyses, focusing on language, on performance. And more recently, scholarship often tries to weave together rigorous philological deep dives with these broader philosophical concerns. The Nietzsche we study today, he is in so many ways a creation of these evolving interpretive lenses. A fascinating thought. When Nietzsche asks, "Did it find out?" he's not genuinely expecting a simple yes or no, is he? Of course not. He's prodding us, forcing us to think. Is it ever truly possible to understand someone from the distant past, especially when their image is filtered through countless layers of interpretation, rivalry, and yes, maybe even malice? This is a classic philosophical move, using a rhetorical question not to get an answer, but to spark deeper reflection. Reflection on the tangled complexities of interpretation, of historical knowledge itself. This question also cracks open the door to a more meta-level reading of the entire aphorism. Perhaps Nietzsche is using this Epicurus-Plato spat as a case study to comment on an unavoidable, perhaps even essential, feature of all philosophical discourse. The way ideas get hopelessly entangled with personal feelings, with style, with the relentless human struggle for recognition and for, well, being correctly understood. So, what different answers could we give to Nietzsche's question? Did it find out? And what does the very fact that Nietzsche ends with a question, rather than a definitive answer, tell us about his views on understanding historical figures like Epicurus? And perhaps, more broadly, about the very nature of philosophy itself. To synthesize then, in this power-packed aphorism, Nietzsche lays out a compelling case study of philosophical prejudice. He locates its slimy roots in personal animosity, stylistic envy, raw ambition. The concept of malice, Bosheit, is dramatically introduced as a potent, driving force in philosophical critique. Style and mise-en-scène, they're not just pretty decorations. They emerge as substantive, powerful elements that can provoke intense, visceral reactions, all tangled up with that crucial question of genuineness versus performance. The act of interpretation itself takes center stage, both as Epicurus interprets Plato, at least according to Nietzsche, and as Nietzsche interprets Epicurus. And it all culminates in that unsettling question about the very possibility of achieving a definitive historical understanding. What this aphorism, subtly, powerfully suggests is that philosophy is not, and perhaps never has been, solely a disinterested, lofty search for abstract truth. Instead, it's an embodied, effective, and often fiercely agonistic practice. It blurs those neat traditional lines between history of philosophy, ethics, aesthetics, and psychology. A real shake-up. We've seen Nietzsche deploy psychological interpretation, etymological analysis, and that bugging genealogical approach to construct his argument. And we've also, importantly, wrestled critically with the speculative nature of his psychological claims about Epicurus. We've acknowledged the risk of oversimplification, of reductionism, while also recognizing the undeniable, provocative power of his unmasking strategy and its fascinating, inherent methodological self-reflexity. It turns back on itself. As we move forward from this, I want you to consider, how might this incredibly detailed, psychological vivisection of a specific philosophical spat inform Nietzsche's broader critique of the prejudices of philosophers? His questioned the motives behind philosophical critique through this vivid, almost novelistic example. So, will he next turn his sharp gaze to the motives behind philosophical system building itself? Or perhaps explore other, even more subtle, insidious forms of prejudice? What's coming next? For our next session, and to really get your gears turning on these complex, challenging issues, I'd like you to chew on these questions. First, given Nietzsche's own incredibly performative, even theatrical style, in this very aphorism, how does that affect our assessment of his critique of Plato's mise-en-scène and Epicurus's supposed genuineness? Does Nietzsche himself manage to escape the charge of being an actor? And does his own potential, malice, his own Bosheit, enhance his philosophical point, or does it fatally undermine it? Second, if we actually accept Nietzsche's core premise, that philosophical positions can, and often do, spring from psychological drives like anger and ambition, how does this radically complicate the traditional philosophical quest for objective truth? Is there a way out? And how might Nietzsche's own perspectivism offer a path to navigate this dizzying terrain? Or does it simply create even more paradoxes regarding the status of his own claims? And third, that final, haunting question. Did it find out? It seems to throw a profound shadow of doubt on the very possibility of definitive historical understanding. How do the various interpretive schools we briefly touched upon, say Straussian, deconstructionist, classical philological, how do they grapple with this fundamental problem of historical recovery? And what might Nietzsche be subtly implying about the nature of philosophical legacy itself, including, perhaps, his own? This will lead us directly into Aphorism 8.